Good day, everyone. Welcome to the One Open Door podcast. My name is David McKay. This is a place for talks and conversations about Zen awareness practice, and particularly about how to live that practice right here, right now, in our lives and in this very world we live in. I hope you enjoy the experience. This particular podcast is something of a postscript to the previous one that was about conscious decision making. This one will essentially stand alone, but you might want to consider going back and listening to that other one first, just for a bit of context. Up to you. If you like what you hear today and feel moved to join in and participate in practice and within the Sangha that I facilitate, I would encourage you very much to do so. If you go to www.theoneopendoor.org, you can see what's available. We do morning meditation, we do a group on Thursday and Sunday evenings at 7 Eastern every week, classes, retreat days, workshops, in-person retreats, and all kinds of things. So I would encourage you to look that up and join in. And if you want to participate, just let me know and I'll make sure you have the information you need. And so now on to the program. And once again, I hope you enjoy the show. In the previous podcast, which I did with my friend Janet, in our conversation we talked about the ways to let go of the different kind of processes that conditioned mind does to keep us from making conscious decisions. We talked about how we make identified, conditioned decisions instead. And the effect of making conditioned decisions is to be out of the moment, be out of life, out of sync with what we might call life, or the mystery or the divine reality, or whatever you want to call it, that's just going moment by moment. And we discussed how it is that if a person is able to make conscious decisions, what that essentially means is not making any decisions. Because someone who is present and aware and in touch with life as it's unfolding will naturally do what life is doing. And so there's no need to be a self that is outside of life making decisions. Instead, the trick to having a good and happy life, and also to be operating within life and acting within life in ways that are skillful and effective and that work, is to be in alignment with life, or you might say in alignment with the intelligence that is animating and unfolding moment by moment. If a person is able to drop conditioned mind, let go of being a separate self who is attempting to exert its will on life and on the world, and is attempting to get its egocentric needs met, reinforce its identity through all of its preferences and opinions and everything. If a person is able to let go of that and get in alignment with life, then life just flows. Like they used to say, be in the flow, go with the flow. That's where that happens. And then life becomes actually very simple and easy. It doesn't become easy, in my experience, in the sense of there aren't challenges to face, because, it is very much a part of our experience on this earth. I think this is universal, that life is extremely challenging. If nothing else, we have bodies, and the bodies age over time. And we have these really sensitive, energetic and emotional systems. And it is unavoidable that we will run into various challenges in life. So I'm not talking about like those things are going to go away if we get into the flow of life. But if we're in the flow of life, what happens is we can allow the intelligence that is animating us and animating everything that is to work through those challenges naturally and sort of on its own. I mean, my experience of that is both. I have both experiences, actually, both as sort of an actor and as an observer. So sometimes it feels like I am actually choosing. I'm choosing to let go. I'm choosing to be in alignment. I'm choosing to be aware of the various conditioned processes that are happening and letting them go. And aligning myself with life. And, choosing certain, content level things. I'm choosing to do this and not that. At other times, though, it doesn't feel that way at all. It feels more like I'm just observing the intelligence taking care of all that stuff. And that is, to me, is sort of the mystery of being a human being on this earth, or one of them anyway, is that we have both experiences. We have the experience of being an individual, an individual with an individual perspective. I'm sitting here where I am, I'm looking in the direction that I am, and I see what I see. I don't see what's behind me. I don't see what you're seeing right now. So we have this individual perspective, and yet we have this universal essence at the same time. We are that divine mystery, most fundamentally and essentially. We are the divine substance, is just another way of saying it, that is within everything that is and everything that we perceive. So we are that and an individual at the same time. So that, to me, is part of the great mystery. And so I think we could say, see what you think of this, that part of the art in spiritual practice and kind of what we're going for is to have both simultaneously. To be both an individual with an individual body who has needs and desires and has this particular perspective, has a history too, has experience, and also to be the eternal, unchanging essence, or as my hero Benkai says, the unborn Buddha mind, to be in the un-Buddha mind, to have those simultaneously. And it's possible. It's possible to have both. There's this ancient Buddhist teaching that nirvana and samsara are the same. Nirvana being the place of transcendence that's beyond space and time. That's beyond individuality, the place of pure essence. Samsara being the place of space and time, of individuality. And also, often samsara is associated with the world of suffering. The place where we can become a separate self and suffer. So this ancient teaching says that nirvana and samsara are the same. So another way of saying what I'm saying right now, that we can be both in the world of form, in the world of stuff, as a person with a body, with feelings, with a mind, with thoughts, and also be in touch with, and really even more than in touch with, and be, we might say, identified with, or just be the eternal essence that is our most fundamental nature. That's the art form. And that is, there's a lot of different ways about talking about what practice is, but that's one of them, and that's one of my favorites actually. That's what we're going for, is learning how to be in that space where we essentially are participating with life as it's unfolding moment by moment. And so in terms of decision making, if you think about it, if I am making, quote, making a decision in this centered way, which as we established, I think in the last podcast, that's the same as not making a decision. If I'm allowing life to make the decision, in other words, then I am in the flow. That's how I am in the flow, is making the decision essentially to be here and let life take me where it will go moment by moment. So that's sort of I think maybe kind of the end point of the previous conversation that we had in the last podcast. And so what I'd like to do now is to illustrate that point and that place by using something that has come into my awareness here recently, or that I've been reminded of, really, which is the Taoist concept or principle called Wu Wei. Taoism, as you very likely know, comes out of China. It's sort of a precursor of Zen, or when Buddhism came to China, it was sort of translated through Taoism and became Zen Buddhism. And I was trained in the Zen tradition, and so it's, when I read or hear things from Taoism, it sounds very familiar and really right on. So Taoism has this idea of Wu Wei, and so it's W-U space W-E-I is how it's spelled if you want to look it up. The way that I see Wu Wei is apparently in Chinese that's translated literally as no action or non-action. And what's being pointed at in that, I think, is this place where we can be, where it's very much like I was just saying a moment ago, where we are participating in life, we're doing things, we're doing things with our body, with our speech, with our mind, and yet there is not a doer of it. It's a place of effortless action where we are essentially being and acting in the same way that the universe is being and acting. That's kind of the way I look at it. Or there's a quote that Roshi used to use all the time. She used to say, "No deed there is, no doer thereof." I think that's a quote from the Buddha, actually, although I'm not completely sure. No deed there is, no doer thereof. Kind of attempting to point to the place where the action is purely spontaneous and natural and doesn't belong to me as a separate self. A more Christian way of saying, and this is something else that she used to quote, is, "Not my will, but thy will be done." Not my will, but thy will be done. So let me not act with this separate will to try to exercise my preferences on the world and get what I, in the sense of ego, wants. Let me instead let go into, to talk about it in a Christian theistic sense, let me let go into God and what God wants. Let my wants and the divine wants be the same, because that's where happiness is. That's where happiness and joy and peace is. And so let me read something to you to illustrate this. And this comes from one of my heroes, my spiritual heroes. His name is Thomas Merton. Many of you probably are familiar with him and his writings. He was a Jesuit monastic who died. I'm actually not sure when he died. I think it might have been in the 60s or 70s, but it could have been later than that. But he was, he lived as a monk for decades and was extremely prolific as a writer. And one of the things that I really admire about him and appreciate about him is that within a Christian context, he had a great openness of heart and mind, and he became interested in Eastern teachings and practices and incorporated that into his own spiritual life and wrote about those things. Very admirable, I think, that when anybody has that kind of openness and is willing to look beyond the context that they are living within to whatever might be useful for themselves in their spiritual life. The book that I'm going to read from is his. It's called The Way of Chuang Tsu. And Chuang Tsu is one of the two kind of prominent Taoist philosophers and teachers from ancient times, along with Lao Tzu. So here's something that Thomas Merton says. He says, "The way of Tao," and Tao is, now, of course, all you're getting in these podcasts is one person's opinion and one person's, somewhat limited understanding of the way things are. So you have to take this with a grain of salt. I'm certainly not an expert or a scholar in any of the things that I talk about. But here's my understanding anyway, that the Tao is basically a word for what I've been calling life with a capital L, the divine mystery, the divine substance, reality, spirit, really whatever you want to call it. It is that which is the essence of everything, that which is sort of the first cause of everything, that we can't really name or understand. It's beyond human understanding. So he says, "The way of Tao is to begin with the simple good with which one is endowed by the very fact of existence. Instead of self-conscious cultivation of this good, which vanishes when we look at it and becomes intangible when we try to grasp it, we grow quietly in the humility of a simple, ordinary life. The secret of the way proposed by Chuang Tsu, who is the Taoist philosopher from way back, is therefore not the accumulation of virtue and merit as taught by Confucius, which is something the author has been talking about. He's been comparing, in this book, he's been comparing Taoism and Confucianism. So the secret of the way proposed by Chuang Tsu is therefore not the accumulation of virtue and merit as taught by Confucius, but Wu Wei, the non-doing or non-action, which is not intent upon results and is not concerned with consciously laid plans or deliberately organized endeavors." And now he's quoting Chuang Tsu. My greatest happiness consists precisely in doing nothing whatever that is calculated to obtain happiness. Perfect joy is to be without joy. If you ask what ought to be done and what ought to not be done on earth to produce happiness, I answer that these questions do not have relative answers. If one is in harmony with the Tao, again, with life, with divinity, with the great mystery, if one is in harmony with the Tao, the answer will make itself clear when the time comes to act. For then one will not act according to the human and self-conscious mode of deliberation, but according to the divine and spontaneous mode of Wu Wei, which is the mode of action of Tao itself, and therefore the source of all good. And that last thing he says there deserves special attention, and to me is possibly the most interesting and fascinating part of this whole idea. Let me read that again. He says, if one is in harmony with the Tao, the answer will make itself clear when the time comes to act. For then one will act not according to the human and self-conscious mode of deliberation, but according to the divine and spontaneous mode of Wu Wei. And this is the really interesting part, which is the mode of action of Tao itself, and therefore the source of all good. So in other words, that's the way I see it. So the Tao, life, whatever you want to call it, has a mode of being. And everything that we experience is that mode of being. Everything that's in nature, our own bodies, our own thoughts, our own feelings, everything. Everything that is within our consciousness is life unfolding, is another way of saying it. That's what it is. And we have this crazy idea that we get through our social conditioning that we can somehow act differently from that. We can act outside of just this natural mode in which everything else in the universe is operating. It's kind of bizarre when you think about that, that we could have such an idea. It just doesn't make any sense. It's also incredibly arrogant and presumptuous, don't you think? That somehow we have this intelligence that allows us to be beyond the divine intelligence and operate apart from that in a way that is distinct from it. It doesn't make any sense. And yet we do, and that's a big cause of our suffering, is that we do think that we have this separate will, to say it another way. We have this separate will, and we can exercise that will, and we can make that will, we make the world conform to that will. That's what causes our suffering. Because it's, in the way that I like to talk about things, and this is what my teacher taught me, suffering is caused by the illusion of a self that is separate from life, separate from the Tao, separate from God, from divinity, whatever you want to use to call that. That's how we suffer, is we are self with this imagined separate will and this imagined separate intelligence, and we can operate independently from life as it's unfolding. But, when you look at that, that doesn't make any sense at all. How could that be? Everything is that life. We talked on an earlier podcast about how, this is another way of saying nirvana and samsara are the same. Form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. The podcast was called The Divine Essence. And, within the forms, the stuff that we see is this divine essence. It is everything. And you could call it various things, that I've already listed. You could also call it awareness. You could call it consciousness. That's what most fundamentally is, it seems to me. And we suffer when we imagine ourselves apart from that. And so what Thomas Merton is saying here is that, if we are acting according to, and I'm quoting him again, the divine and spontaneous mode of Wu Wei, then we're acting in the mode of the Tao itself, in the mode of life itself. And that is skillful action. That is how to be in the world where there's, where the resistance doesn't happen, and the conflict and the struggle doesn't happen. Because if we're just being life as it's unfolding, then life will go wherever it will go, and we'll go with it, and all will be well. And again, I'm not saying that all will be well in the sense that we're going to get everything that we want, and all of our circumstances will completely conform to our will. That's suffering, actually, is to desire to have everything that we want in an ego sense. I want what will reinforce my conditioned identity. That's the way most people are living their lives, I think, is they are seeking through their energy and their money and their time to have everything they think they need to have in order to reinforce their conditioned identity. That's not a happy thing. And so I'm not saying that by aligning ourselves with the Tao in this process called Wu Wei and just being life, just doing life as life is doing itself, I'm not saying that is going to make everything just go the way that ego wants it to go. It most certainly won't. And, a lot of times it will actually go the other way. Because now I'm going to talk in a way that anthropomorphizes the Tao and life. And so you'll have to forgive me for that. I'm not meaning to imply that it is, some kind of divine being out there or anything. But it's hard to talk about these things without a subject and object. So just remember, as I'm speaking, I'm not talking about like something like an entity that's separate. But at any rate, my experience is that when I am in alignment with the Tao, then what we might say the Tao wants for me or life wants for me is often perfectly opposite to what my ego wants. My ego wants to be safe, undisturbed. It wants to be right all the time. It wants to be able to make other people wrong. It wants to be a victim, all these kinds of things. And life doesn't support that. It also wants to feel kind of deprived and put out. Or it wants to feel dissatisfied. So it wants to run around and get things and get experiences as if that's somehow going to be fulfilling and then be disappointed at that and feel dissatisfied with that. That's not what life wants for me, to speak about it in that anthropomorphical, that's the right way to say it, way. That's not what life wants for me. What life wants for me is to be here, to let go of a self, and to be the divinity that I am, to be the essence that I am, to be the pure experience of life unfolding that I am. That's what life is doing. And if I let life do that through me, then that's the experience I have. And, in this really crazy, beautiful way, I disappear into that. I, as a separate self, disappears into that flow. Now, I, as pure awareness, does not disappear into that flow, because I, as pure awareness, is that flow. So I get to be aware. I just don't get to be an I who is aware. That's the trick. And that's the thing, for many of us, that's so difficult to let go of, because we are powerfully taught as children, and also just through our own experience, through our own imagined experience, let me say, that we are an I that is having our experience instead of just being pure experience without an I. Thomas Merton goes on to say, the other way, so the other way than what he was talking about, the way of Wu Wei, the other way, the way of conscious striving, even though it may claim to be a way of virtue, is fundamentally a way of self-aggrandizement, and it is consequently bound to come into conflict with the Tao. So what he's saying there, I think, is there's two modes of existence. There's the one that is most common and almost universal, which is to be a self that is, as I've been saying, going around, trying to collect things and experiences that reinforce that sense of self. And there's this other way of Wu Wei. And if we are doing the former, then we are in conflict with the Tao. And you know that experience, I bet, right? When you're identified in conditioned mind, life is a struggle. You have to fight for what you want. Doesn't it feel like, kind of the world is out to get me, because it's not cooperating. And the reason for that, of course, is that it's not cooperating. It actually isn't cooperating, because life as it is does not cooperate with an ego that is trying to exercise its own will and control life. because that's not what life is doing. Life is doing what it's doing without ego. It is egoless, and that's what's so beautiful about it. That's why there's harmony within it, like the harmony in nature. Like nature's in perfect harmony. Why is that? Because there's no ego there. As soon as there's an ego, we get out of sync with life, and we move ourselves into a place of disharmony, and then that's when we suffer. Okay, so after the stuff I just read, Thomas Merton goes into a digression, and then he comes back to the same kind of essential point about Wu Wei. Here's what he says next. He says, Chuang Tsu's paradoxical teaching that, quote, you never find happiness until you stop looking for it, unquote, must not, therefore, be negatively interpreted. He is not preaching a retreat from a full, active human existence into inertia and quietism. He is, in fact, saying that happiness can be found, but only by non-seeking and non-action. That's a very interesting and paradoxical statement, isn't it? That happiness can be found, but only by non-seeking and non-action. What is he saying there? Well, I think he's saying, what I've been saying from the beginning, that, to seek for it requires a self to seek, and that self will never find happiness. To act in such a way as to try to acquire it, again, requires a self, and that action does not produce happiness. That action actually produces suffering because it is coming from a self and supports a self. Thomas Merton then goes on to say, so happiness can be found, but not as a result of a program or of a system. A program or a system has this disadvantage. It tends to situate happiness in one kind of action only and seek it only there. But the happiness and freedom with which Chuang Tsu saw in the Tao is to be found everywhere, since the Tao is everywhere. And until one can learn to act with such freedom from care that all action is, quote, perfect joy because without joy, end quote, one cannot really be happy in anything. And then he quotes somebody else who sums it up by saying that the sage will accompany everything and welcome everything, everything being in the course of being constructed and in the course of being destroyed. Hence he cannot but obtain joy in freedom, and his joy is unconditional. Isn't that a beautiful thought and a beautiful possibility? That our joy can be unconditional. And it makes sense that it would be so if what I have been saying in this podcast is true. Because, for most people, if we're living in the mode of life where we're being an ego, attempting to seek things that reinforce our sense of self, then we're dependent. All of our inner experience is dependent on outside things. And isn't that the trap that we fall into as conditioned human beings? That we believe that all of our experience is being caused by external things? And what an unhappy and unfortunate trap that is, right? Because if I believe that, then I have to go through life attempting to rearrange all my circumstances so that they produce happiness. And that is, not only is that a, exhausting and frustrating task, but it's impossible. That's never going to happen because my happiness is not caused by external things. It's not dependent on external things. It's dependent on where I am within myself. If I am within conditioned mind, when I say I there, of course, again, it's hard to talk about this stuff because our language, implies there's pronouns, and it implies subject object, but I think you know what I mean. Consciousness, I'm talking about consciousness there, so let me try to say it without that pronoun. When consciousness is life unfolding, when there's not a differentiation, then there's freedom, there's happiness, there's no dependency there. And so that's the place where I think we can say that the joy is unconditional. It's not conditioned by anything. I experience joy. I am joy. We have to even take that pronoun out of there. Joy is, because who I experience myself to be is simply life unfolding. not somebody who is experiencing life unfolding, but just the experience of life unfolding. And that's what true joy really is. And it's independent of circumstances. That joy can be there even when things are not going your way, even when you're in some kind of pain. Now, of course, it's more difficult to be in that place of joy when things are not going your way or when you're in some kind of pain, because the way we attempt to survive those kinds of situations is by becoming a self who is then doing something about that. And then, of course, as soon as we become that self, the joy goes away. But it is possible. It's possible to be detached from our experience to the extent that we experience joy even in difficulty. And that kind of detachment, that's actually kind of a tricky word to use because that implies separation. What I'm trying to point to there is a detachment that is the same as perfect and complete involvement with. Those two things are actually the same. Real detachment is the same as perfect involvement in our experience. Attachment happens when we are outside of our experience, having preferences about it and clinging to it. Detachment happens when we fully allow our experience to be there without resistance, and we're just aware of it as it's unfolding. So anyway, that's where the joy happens, is when the detachment is there. Thomas Merton goes on to say, the true character of Wu Wei is not mere inactivity, but perfect action, because it is act without activity. So in other words, this is the way I interpret that, without someone acting. It is act without activity. In other words, it is action not carried out independently of heaven and earth and in conflict with the dynamism of the whole, but in perfect harmony with the whole. And as I've been saying, the way to accomplish that is to let go of all of our preferences and opinions, the needs and desires that our ego has, and just go where life is going. So I'll read that again. He says, in other words, it is action not carried out independently of heaven and earth and in conflict with the dynamism of the whole, but in perfect harmony with the whole. It is not mere passivity, but it is action that seems both effortless and spontaneous. I would say it is action that is both effortless and spontaneous because performed rightly, and that's in quotes, or in perfect accordance with our nature and with our place in the scheme of things. Let me read that sentence again. He said, it's not mere passivity, but it is action that is both effortless and spontaneous because performed rightly. And what he means by that is in perfect accordance with our nature and with our place in the scheme of things. It is completely free because there is in it no force and no violence. It is not conditioned or limited by our own individual needs and desires, or even by our theories and ideas. And that last bit, I think, is particularly important to remember because, it's easy to take this kind of information and start to intellectualize it. And try, and it's understandable why we would want to do that because this stuff is, it's difficult to understand. And the kind of understanding that we're going for, and that is really the only kind of way to understand it, is a way that's direct and intuitive, rather than logical and intellectual, even though it is logical to a certain degree. So to say that in another way, the way to understand it is to be it, not to think it. And yet, because we are conditioned in the way that we are, and we rely so heavily on our conditioned mind to make sense of things, we want to intellectualize it, and so that we can control it, basically, and we can make it happen when we want to make it happen. And of course, that's not going to work. And so, what he's saying there, I think, is that in this place of Wu Wei, where we are just allowing life to move and being that life as it moves and as it acts and as it does whatever it does, even through our own body, mouth, and mind. What we have to be willing to let go of in order for that to happen is our ideas about that. We have to let go of this conditioned tendency we have to be outside of things, thinking about them, putting them in boxes and categories. And instead let those things go, and just from a place of trust, just allow ourselves to be life as it unfolds. And one more little, I'm going to let you go in just a second, but one more little qualifier there that comes up sometimes when I talk with people about this is, people have the ideas like, well, if I do that, then I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit around and just kind of be in bliss, or I won't know what to do. And boy, that is so not my experience. When we're in alignment with the Tao, to use that phrasing, it's extremely active. If you just look around at, look at the birds and the bees, and all the critters. Right now, I don't know if you can hear this. There's little peepers. There's these frogs that come out in the spring in North Carolina, and they live in the little marshy areas, and they're peeping right now. They're really active. They're doing what they do. They're in perfect alignment with the Tao and doing what they do. They're present, they're fully themselves. I project. Of course, I can't really know, but I don't project that these peepers are sitting there wondering if they're good peepers or not, if they're peeping correctly or that kind of thing. They're just in the moment. They're in the Tao, and they're effortlessly acting from their authentic nature as spring peepers. That's what we can do too. And so, but it's active. It's not passive at all. And, in terms of the second point, well, if I just let go into life, am I going to know what to do? Absolutely. Because part of what happens there is we gain real clarity. The trouble with being in conditioned mind is we have all these better ideas. That's a phrase that comes from the monastery. What it's meant by that is, sort of ideas that are outside of the flow of life about the way things should be. We end up having all these better ideas. And we go through life making up stuff to believe in. I'm going to do a podcast on that whole thing soon about what we know and what we make up. But we go through life making stuff up to believe in. And so we're actually, the information that we are relating to as we're attempting to do whatever we do is false. It's based on false premises. It's based on assumptions that we were taught to make when we were children. And so we're not going through life with good information. But when we can let go into the Tao, then there's a clarity that happens, because the Tao, life, divinity, reality, whatever you might call that, is intelligent. You might even say it is intelligence. Like the intelligence that we each experience with, in a way that feels like within our own minds, like that's my intelligence. That is the intelligence of life. It just happens to be encapsulated within this form, but there's no difference other than, the perception is limited by the form that it's within. But that intelligence is within everything. It's what makes the trees grow. What makes the sun go across the sky and the planets spin. And that is who we are. And so if we get here in touch with who we are, and who we are is the same as life unfolding, there is no difference, then that intelligence operates and we become aware of it. And in this way that I have found in my life to be incredibly miraculous, and I talked about this a little bit in the last podcast in that conversation with Janet. In my experience, the effect of that is magical, because I'm given exactly the information that I need moment by moment as I go through. If I will just let it, and that's the hard thing to do, of course. It's hard to let go of the ego that wants to control everything and make it go its way. If I can just let go of that and just let life lead instead, then the divine intelligence that is the same as my intelligence, that is the same as me, will, moment by moment, show me exactly what to do, show me how to be, show me how to act. So much so that I don't need to be a somebody doing anything. So let's practice that, shall we? Let's practice being in the flow. Practice letting go of our better ideas. Letting go of the stuff that we believe, that we're making up. Especially the stuff, all the negative stuff that we make up about how the world is and who we are. Let's just let all that stuff go. Let's remember and notice the beauty and the harmony of life unfolding. And let's say yes. Want to? let's say yes and just see what happens. See what happens in a life that is given over to just the beautiful, mysterious, moment by moment unfolding of the Tao. Thanks everyone for listening. I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate and value your attention. Take care, be well, and I hope you have a beautiful day.